Brooklyn is also a great industrial city with miles upon miles of waterfront, sometimes called the stepping-off point of the world. Brooklyn buys what the world has to sell and sells to the world about everything under the sun. Made in Brooklyn.
Born in Brooklyn, New York, Bernie Sanders found his home in the beautiful Green Mountains of Vermont. Unlike the city, the Vermont myth fosters a quintessential small-town feeling with communities made up of tree huggers, syrup lovers, Subaru drivers, among other stereotypes. Although some may argue Bernie is not a true Vermonter, he is now representing Vermont in the presidential campaign. We explored the local opinions of the Bernie Sanders campaign and the relation to the Vermont myth. Home for you.
So I'm from a town called Bolton, Connecticut. It's a real small town. My graduating class was like 84. It's in between Hartford and Yukon, so kind of north central Connecticut.
Do you consider yourself a Vermonter?
Well, I consider myself a nutmaker. That's what they call someone from Connecticut back home. But Vermont definitely has a place in my heart. I've only been here for 2.5 years now, so I wouldn't feel right calling it my home, considering I lived in Connecticut for the other 18 years or so. But it definitely has a place. It'll have a place in my life moving forward.
What are some stereotypes of Vermont you've come across?
When I got accepted into UVM, my teachers were like, oh, you're going to some hippie town where people don't shower and have long dreadlocked hair and stuff like that. And to an extent, you do see that around, but you see that everywhere. So I think some of the stereotypes that you hear are a little overblown, but at the same time, there definitely are some examples that are out there that kind of signify that kind of hippie culture here in Burlington, Vermont in general.
Do you support Bernie Sanders?
Well, I definitely admire Senator Sanders' passion, and I think a lot of people buy into his populist rhetoric, and people will look at him and think that he's speaking from the heart. Policy-wise, I don't see eye to eye with Senator Sanders that much, but I do respect him and some of the initiatives that some of the goals that he's trying to achieve. I just don't necessarily agree with how to get to those goals.
How do you think Bernie Sanders embodies Vermont, and how is he going to use this to anchor his campaign?
Well, I think the way he embodies Vermont is he's, like I mentioned a minute ago, he's a very populist kind of guy. He is talking directly to the people. He kind of puts aside special interest groups, and he wants to do what he thinks is best for kind of the everyday person out there, which is kind of what Vermont is built around. And I think he's using that kind of mantra when he's talking in Iowa, New Hampshire, and across the country. And people really like that because they feel like he's talking directly to them and trying to do stuff for them, opposed to for a big corporation or a big union or some other special interest group. So I think he's definitely using that to his advantage, and there's a lot of roots there from his kind of home state.
Thank you.
Where do you live?
I live in Burlington, Vermont.
Do you consider yourself a Vermonter?
I don't, no. I grew up in Europe and then in California. I hadn't set foot in Vermont until I took the job here, so I'm learning. I'm not a Vermonter.
So what are some stereotypes of Vermont you've picked up since you've been here?
That I've picked up since I've been here? So these are Burlington stereotypes as much as they are Vermont stereotypes. One thing I've absorbed is that there are a lot of different Vermonts, really, and we live in one of them that's remote from some of the others. But I think of Vermont as having a kind of left political culture, an environmentalist culture, a kind of back to the land mentality, an obsession with physical fitness and the outdoors. You could call it a kind of crunchy culture if you were peddling in stereotypes.
Definitely, yes.
Local food, artisanal food, and all of this consistent with this sort of community and environmental ethic.
And how do you think Bernie Sanders uses these stereotypes or the myth of Vermont to appeal to voters?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, one other thing, as I was thinking about this question, I mean, the other aspect of Vermont, and the other Vermont stereotype, has to do with a kind of libertarianism and independence. So there's definitely some. I mean, you can see, I think, in his attitude on guns, you can see Vermont and a certain kind of Vermont culture coming out. A sort of accords maybe. I was asking my aunt who's visiting this weekend what her stereotypes about Vermont are, and she sort of said, well, independence and being close to the land and kind of libertarianism. So. I see that reflected in some of what he says, but maybe that's not using these. I don't know, to be honest, I don't know that many people outside of Vermont have independent Vermont stereotypes. I actually think Bernie Sanders is sort of responsible for helping popularize an idea of Vermont. He's probably the best known Vermonter around, and as a result of coming to know him, people have come to associate Vermont now with a certain kind of politics that he represents.
So I think I didn't start out in Vermont, but I think I'm from Vermont.
Do you consider yourself a Vermonter?
Sure, I spent most of my life here.
What are some stereotypes of Vermont that you've heard or seen throughout the years?
Mostly in media, and probably coalesced around Howard Dean's run for the presidency, that we all drove Volvos and wore fancy clothes from LL Bean. You must have encountered those stereotypes in your course. I find that has very little to do with the people I know in Vermont.
And how do you feel that Bernie Sanders embodies the state of Vermont in his campaign for presidency?
Well, can I take a step back and say I think he represents the state of Vermont very well, and I'm not talking as a campaign thing. I mean, I think he represents the state of Vermont, and this is why he gets elected with a greater majority than any other politician, because he understands that that Vermonters have many allegiances and many differences. Some are deeply committed to environmental causes, and others are hunters, but they both want to see our natural lands preserved. Some are middle class and some are poor, but they both find their lives made more difficult by large multinational corporations. You know that the largest employer in Chittenden County is IBM, now sold to a foreign wealth fund. It used to have 9,000 workers and it now has 3,000. And that's something of interest to all sorts of people in Vermont. Not only the people who work at IBM, but the people who repair their cars or prepare their food in restaurants. And I think Bernie's found a way to articulate the concerns of not just one small group, but of many people. It often coalesces around his concern that the very wealthy and modern corporate capitalism, often multinational capitalism, it doesn't really work for most people. And that's poor people and elderly people and young people.
So what are some Vermont stereotypes?
Some Vermont stereotypes, well, I think they've changed as Vermont has changed. I think,
And what do you think, what is your main interest with
I didn't know much about Vermont before I came here. I barely knew where it was. I knew it was a very rural state, and I also know that it was one of the least likely places I thought I'd wind up.
Yeah.
In seven.
Okay, yeah. And how do you think Bernie Sanders appeals to Vermonters?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders was one of the first, one of the first political figures in Vermont to recognize that the average Vermonter was not exactly living an upper middle class life, and that most Vermonters were in fact living at a level that was making it difficult for them as workers to afford the basic necessities of life.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and I think people understood that he understood that, and they appreciated it, and that when he told them that he would try to help the situation, He did, and he transformed the city of Burlington. And when I got here, the main tourist attraction was a jail in the middle of downtown. It's not there. I don't know if that was his doing or not. He helped it from being overly boutiqued by redevelopment and gentrification. Well, to some extent that's happened. And he has made connections with not just liberals, for sure. He gets a higher turnout in the Northeast Kingdom than would likely be expected from anybody. And in that sense, he's crossed over ethnic lines and rural and urban stereotypes, and he's the only one running for president now, I believe, who is extremely popular in his own home state. I cannot tell you how the other ones are doing, but I have a feeling Mr. Christie, for example, as governor of New Jersey, after he crossed down the George Washington Bridge, is not doing well.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
That's it?
Yep.
Thank you.
What are the first three words you think of when you hear the word Bernie Sanders?
Socialist, Democrat. 2016, is that a word?
First three words that come to your mind when you hear the word Vermont.
My second home. Cold. Rugged.
What are the first three words that come into your mind when you think of the word Bernie Sanders?
Interesting, old, experience.
What are the first three words that come to your mind when you hear the word Vermont?
Leaves, skiing, and mountains.
What are the first three words that come to mind when you think of the word Bernie Sanders?
Realist.
Two more.
He's realist. He's actually trying to change what others are kind of avoiding, and he doesn't really care about what the 1% thinks. He kind of cares about what 99% need.
What are the first three words that come to your mind when you hear the word Vermont?
Maple, leaves, and skiing.
What are the first three words that come to your head when you think of the word Bernie Sanders?
Socialist, politician. Is he a Democrat?
What are the first three words that come to mind when you hear the word Vermont?
Snow, skiing, and mountains.
What are the first three words that pop into your head when you think of the word Bernie Sanders?
Old man, president, and
What are the first three words that come to your mind when you hear the word Vermont?
maple, trees, and
What are the first three words that pop into your head when you think of the word Bernie Sanders?
awesome, white hair, probably who I'm gonna vote for.
What are the first three words that come to your mind when you hear the word Vermont? Maple syrup, skiing, UVM.
What are the first three words when you think of the word Vermont?
Green farm cow.
What are the first three words that pop into your head when you think of Bernie Sanders?
Inspirational, fair, Vermont.
What are the first three words you think of when you hear the word Vermont?
Cold, flannels, and farms.
After exploring the relationship between Bernie Sanders and Vermont, we discovered that there are many similarities between the Vermont myth and Bernie's campaign model. The Vermont myth holds features of a small town in which the community works together to support each other in times of adversity. Bernie's policies on social welfare and the distribution of wealth reflect this Vermont stereotype. Bernie also declared that his biggest concern is the environment and global warming. This notion had a resounding echo in the minds and hearts of Vermonters who have been regarded as tree huggers and had the first city to be run completely on renewable energy. In the upcoming months, we shall see how this Vermonter competes at a national level.